Hello, it's good to see you. Today we are going to be reading some more olden times stories. Now there are no pictures, so you don't have to worry about looking at anything. You can just listen. I'm just going to be reading these to you. Now I am a little bit under the weather today, so my voice may sound a little bit different. I'm a bit sick today. I'm all right. I'm just a little bit under the weather, but I wanted to read some stories to you. Now these are stories that were told by people who lived back in the early 1900s mostly, and they're going to tell you a little bit about their life and things that they experienced. And these are people from central North Carolina, so these are just stories as they told them. And the name of the first little article here, the little story, it is Rubbing the Hide Off Your Knuckles by Arlene Bennett Freeman. I was born in 1929 in Starr, that's in North Carolina. I was one of a set of twins delivered at home by Dr. Griffin. My twin sister's name is Arlene, and we had two brothers, Eugene and Clyde, and a sister, Irene. My parents were Jonah and Phoebe Covington Bennett. We lived in a 4-room house with no electric lights or running water. We had to carry our water from a spring where there was also a wooden box to keep our milk cool. Let's see. Our Christmas was very slim. We would get fruit and maybe a doll, and one year we just got fruit. That made us appreciate life more when we got older. We had to work in the fields till dark when we got home from school. Then when we would get our school lessons, we had to study by kerosene lamps and by fireplace light in the winter. Electric lights weren't turned on until 1948. Kerosene was about 10 cents a gallon back then. We used kerosene lanterns to go a half-mile through the woods when we went to our aunt's and uncle's house for corn shuckings. When we came back, we would look for raccoons, but we never saw one. I guess we were making too much noise. We carried our clothes to Grandma's to wash. She had a big black wash pot on the branch, and we built a fire around it and boiled our clothes. We scrubbed them on a scrub board, and it would rub the hide off your knuckles if you scrubbed too hard. It was a lot of work. I'm glad laundry is much easier to do today. I remember hearing my grandmother talk about doing that. I'm very glad I don't have to do that. I love my washing machine. We lived next to the railroad track, and there were steam engines in my day. Sometimes we would listen to see if the train would make the hill. It would go so slow at first, and we would imagine the engine would say, "I think I can, I think I can." Speaking of which, and then it would get faster and get over the hill. We took sponge baths during the week, but on weekends we filled the tin tub with water and left it outside to get warm for our baths. If the weather was warm enough, we went to the creek to take a bath. I remember some of the old tales from back then, like when a black cat crosses the road, take off your hat and spit in it and turn it around. Walking under a ladder brought bad luck, and tossing salt over your shoulder brought good luck. And the saying, "Marry in white, your love is true. Marry in blue, your love is true. Marry in pink, your love will sink." I remember going to church, and I will always remember our Sunday school teachers, Mrs. James and Mrs. Pearl Harper. They were very impressive to me. I wanted to be like them. We had very few toys. We made mud pies and playhouses in the woods where there was moss on the ground. We dug up the moss to make beds and pillows, things you don't see kids doing today. I actually used to do that as a child, but we lived way out in the woods. We would bend down small trees and ride them like horses. I used to do that. We found something to do to entertain ourselves. We had a wind-up phonograph that we enjoyed very much. When my sister and I were about 8 years old, there was this older guy that she didn't like very much. When he came around, we would put on this one record we had called "Get Away, Old Man, Get Away." We really got a big laugh out of that. My brothers, Clyde and Eugene, were drafted into the Army during World War II, and us girls were left at home to help on the farm. One time, Arlene and I were plowing. She was driving the horse, and I was holding the plow, and the horse decided to come home. We couldn't stop the horse, but it finally stopped by itself. We didn't get hurt. On Sundays in the summer of 1945, we loaded up a big truck and headed back to where Mama and Dada moved from Stokes County in 1922 to pick cherries. We had a wonderful time. The old house is sold now, so we don't go back. We met at some of the cousins' houses and played marbles, softball, hopscotch, and horseshoe games. We didn't have cars at that time, and we walked every place we went, including church. We went to church for a year and didn't miss a Sunday. Mama and Dada saw that we had clothes to wear. They were homemade, and some of them were made out of feed sacks. We didn't know what a bought dress was. Our Aunt Libby Covington made a lot of our clothes. She was a good seamstress. One time when we were about 6 years old, Arlene and I decided to hurry up supper, so we slipped out to milk the cow. I was on one side and Arlene was on the other, and we milked the cow. We think back and wonder why the cow didn't kick us over. We were lucky. We had to start milking cows from then on. We had a swimming hole down by the creek, and in the summer, every day after lunch, we went swimming. We would tell Mama and Daddy that we would be back in about 45 minutes, but it was always an hour or more before we got back in the fields. My brother and sister sometimes went to the walk-in theater to see Hopalong Cassidy, Tex Ritter, Gene Autry, and some of the musicals. It cost 20 cents to go to the movies. We couldn't go until Friday or Saturday night. Our family had to work hard in the fields, and we exchanged work with neighbors for no pay. We worked at tobacco barns for Grandma and Grandpa Covington, Isla and Clarence Coggins, Reed and Martha Covington, and everywhere we worked, the family cooked dinner for everyone. What a meal they would prepare. I especially remember Grandma's cold bread apple pie. We had to chop the grass in the cornfield after it had been tilled by a horse and plow. We had to uncover the plants that had been covered up by the clods. We chopped or hoed tobacco and suckered it as the plants got large. Then it was priming time, and 3 or 4 leaves had to be removed from the plant once a week for 3 or 4 weeks. The leaves were taken from the field in a tobacco sled to the barn where the crew was to tie it on sticks. Each stringer had 2 handers who handed 3 leaves in a bunch to the stringer. The stringer looped the string around the leaf stems, one bunch to one side of the stick, another bunch to the other side. When the stick was filled, the string was looped in a knot on the end so the leaves would not fall off. After all the leaves were strung on sticks, the sticks were placed in the tobacco barn so the tobacco could be cured. The barn was heated by flues that ran through it on the floor, and it took 3 or 4 days to cure the tobacco. Then it was taken down and carried to a pack house to wait till the tobacco markets opened. It had to be taken from the sticks and graded as to color and the way it looked, good, medium, trash. Then arranged in bundles that were wrapped on the stem end of the leaves with another leaf of tobacco. The bundles were put back on the stick. Then it was ready for market. It was an all-day job. Corn shuckings were fun. When someone had one, all the neighbors would come to that home to shuck and eat, and sometimes have a square dance. The corn would be piled up, and benches would be fixed for people to sit on. We would husk the corn and throw it over on the other side. It would afterwards go in bushel baskets into the corn crib. If you found a red ear, you got to kiss the boy of your choice. The ladies would get together and cook things like beans, corn, pumpkin, and other pies, sweet potatoes, cakes, and chicken and dumplings. It was a feast on our tables. Wheat threshings were like corn shuckings. All the neighbors got together, and the men and children would be in the barn to throw the bundles of wheat down to the ones feeding the threshing machine. There would be someone to take off the bag of wheat when it got full. I remember the dirt roads, which were bad when it rained or when they froze over. The routes would be so deep you sometimes had to be pulled out of the mud. When the roads got that bad, we had to walk a mile to get on the school bus because the water would be so deep the bus couldn't get through. The roads were rough until they were finally tarred. Mama would put a meal on the table like nobody else. I wish I had some of her recipes, like canning vegetables, sauerkraut, and fruits. We had plenty to eat because we had our own cows, hogs, chickens, and fresh vegetables. I remember Mama got up around 4:30 to build a fire in the wood cook stove to cook breakfast. We would all have to get up and wash our hands and faces. Mama believed in signs like, never can kraut while the sign is in the bowels, or feet, or the kraut would smell like that. I will always remember that. We grew up with an outhouse. You had to have a flashlight to go out after it was dark, and we had to carry our water from a spring until my dada and uncles dug a well. They had a bucket made to bring the dirt back up when they hit rock. They had to go down and dynamite it. You had to wind up the man who was setting off the blast in a hurry. It was scary, but there were no accidents. When the well was finished, we lowered down a bucket on a rope and pulled it up on a windlass. There were weights on the bucket to make it sink. We drank water from a dipper. I went to business school in Winston-Salem, and I stayed with my aunt and rode the work bus to school. I quit business school after 3 months and came home to go to work. I was a knitter at Russell Hosiery Mills, and I worked 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 65 cents an hour. If we got a raise, the boss man said, "Don't tell anyone you got a nickel raise." Those were hard times, but they have advanced, and it's a lot better and easier now. I enjoyed working in the knitting room, and I was transferred to be an instructor. I retired in 1995. I worked at Russell Hosiery Mill until they sold out to Fruit of the Loom. I stayed with the company as an instructor for 41 years. The pay had increased to $9.40 from the day I started to work, a big increase. I met my husband, Wilburn Freeman, in August 1951 through a friend on a blind date. There wasn't much to do on dates. We went to church revivals. One time we were on our way to McGead to see one of Wilburn's cousins when he pulled off at the Church Forks of Little River Baptist Church. He gave me my engagement ring, and I was surprised. We got married at Star Baptist Church on March 22, 1952. Our parents, cousins, and other kin were there. We went to North Wilkesboro on our honeymoon, and we went to church in Taylorsville on Sunday. We lived with our parents until we could find our own place, and Wilburn worked in Greensboro. It was a good life, but it was hard making ends meet and buying a car. Our only child, Isla Mae, was born in 1953, and there were other things we had to be responsible for. Isla took piano lessons for 10 years, and she was real good. When she graduated in 1973, she went to Pembroke College for a year, then decided to get married. She and her husband moved to Canada. After she left, Wilburn and I were not going to sit behind closed doors. We decided to go to Greensboro and take dancing lessons from Fred Astaire. We learned a lot. Wilburn and I traveled a lot too. We've been to most of the southern states, and we've been to Canada several times to see our granddaughters, Heather and Dana. We've done a lot of camping. We fished at the coast, and we made several trips to Florida for Christmas. Our granddaughters make us happiest when we are all together for the holidays. We also have a great-granddaughter, Kayla, who will be 3 years old October 22nd. I baked her first birthday cake at Fort Hood, Texas. Our granddaughters grew up going to the beach and camping and fishing. One time, Heather and Kayla entered a fishing tournament for kids. Kayla got in the mud, and while her mother was getting her out, Kayla got a bite and her line broke. She got another bite, and her mother told her to pick up the rod. "No," said Kayla, "it's nasty." But she finally did pick it up, and the fish she caught won her a second-place trophy. And that is the end. The next story we have is Rabbit Eggs in the Salad Patch and the White Owl by Janie A. Freeman. I was born May 16th, 1924. I have so many good memories from a long, short time ago and unto now. I didn't word this. I remember a new pair of high-top boys' shoes my grandpa bought for me. Daddy and Grandpa went to carry the wagon load of cotton to the cotton gin, and Grandpa bought me a pair of high-top, ankle-high shoes. My grandpa was Mark Cagle, and Grandma was Sina Ussery Cagle. We lived near my grandparents, and I was the oldest and had 2 sisters. My dad came from Alabama. 2 men, Walter and Rufus Kennedy, went to Alabama from Biscoe to work in turpentine, and met 2 of my dad's sisters, Hattie and Viola, and they married. So the 2 brothers married the 2 Ard sisters and brought them back to near Biscoe and raised their families. They never went back to Alabama. My dad got up here somehow and stayed with the Tom Hurley family in Biscoe, and then with the Spencer and Et Howell family. Mr. Howell brought my dad down to the Mart Cagle home to see his daughter, May Cagle. Well, so they were married the same year they met. Grandpa cut some trees and carried them to a sawmill and had the lumber cut and built my mom and dad a house. We always had good neighbors. Neighbors lived about a mile apart. The George Parsons Colin and Sandy Parson family, Archie Northcutt and Warners, and Pat Elam McCaskill, Dave McCaskill family, Jeff and Mert Parrish, Alexander McCaskill family, Neil McCaskill, and others, along with Mr. Logan and Victoria. They were about a mile either way from Grandpa's house. About 70 years ago, neighbors were neighbors and good neighbors. When I was old enough to go to school, I was supposed to go to Green Ridge School, but I could not walk that far alone. So I had to wait until my sister Jessie got old enough to go to school. That was the last time they had Green Ridge School there, so we went over to Dave McCaskill's and met the Biscoe school bus. If we missed the bus, Dave McCaskill would walk home with us. We had a lamp for light and a fireplace and a wood cook stove. We brought in stove wood to cook and wood to keep us warm by the fireplace. We had chickens, guineas, turkeys, cows, hogs, and mules. I remember after my grandparents died, we moved up in Grandpa's house. It was a big house to me. It's still standing. It was set on big pillars, I guess about 3 feet from the ground. They had lightning rods, and I remember a double fireplace. I don't know what kind of trees the house pillars were cut from. They were big round blocks. Oh yes, the kitchen was off from the house a little, so I guess the reason was to have the kitchen built away from the house, so if the house got burned, the kitchen wouldn't. Anyway, the well was a little ways kind of between the kitchen and house. I remember the Dave McCaskill home had a wooden walkway between the kitchen and house, no top on the walkway. And another home I remember was the Colin Parson family. Their kitchen was built a little way farther from Granddad's. Then there was the Long home, and they had their well on their back porch. All the wells had a windlass and bucket to draw up their water, bucket by bucket, to cook with and take a bath before the fireplace. They washed their clothes in big tin tubs and a big black wash pot to wash and boil their clothes with homemade lye soap. I remember Grandma's tub of ashes behind the smokehouse. She would put water on the ashes, the best I can remember, so it drained out, and I think the drippings were used with lye to make soap. Well, in our little house below Grandpa's house, when we moved in his house, I remember the different people lived in the little house. They had to bring water from where we lived. There was an old man, Roe Hall, and son, Claude. His daughter was Senia Hall Cork, and later she married Colin Parson. The Halls moved to another house on the place and carried their water from a spring under a big hill. I think they washed their clothes at the spring and spread them on bushes to dry. So a lot of different people at different times lived in this little house. I remember Barney and Clady Moore Harville lived there, and Nettie Sue was born there. Everyone loved that baby and the other little girl, Betty Lou. She was about 2 when they moved there. A cousin of Barney's stayed with them and helped him haul slabs. Well, this young fellow came up for a bucket of water and seen me. My dad said he didn't need to see me. His brother was bad company, so that was the end of that. When I was in the 6th grade, we moved into another house of Grandpa's near the highway, so we didn't have to walk so far to meet the school bus. I was going into the 7th grade at Candor School. My 4th grade teacher was Miss Ida Mae Friedland, and at Candor School, my 7th grade teacher was Miss Lois Friedland, her sister from Greensboro. I liked Candor School and finished 11th grade in 1943 in May. I finished school on a Friday and went to work in the cotton mill on Monday. I married in August 1943. I worked for about 3 years when my husband came home from the Army. My mother gave us 1 acre, and Clyde, my husband, cut logs and carried them to the mill and had the lumber cut and built us a house. That house has been home from 1946 to now. Clyde learned how to operate bulldozers while working in the Army. He was the first to take a dozer on the Burma Road in India. So John McDowell, a contractor from Ashboro, hired him to operate a dozer along the drive to Ashboro. He operated the county dozer until the county decided to sell the dozer. Then a friend, Ralph Batten, a merchant in Biscoe, bought the county dozer for Clyde and gave him enough work and then more work to pay for the dozer. He did dozer work for farmers as always. He cleared land terraces, built ponds, anything people needed done for many years. Clyde died on January 30th, 1985. I remember Grandpa Freeman, Clyde's dad. He was a blacksmith. He had a blacksmith shop then in the space between Candor Bank and Mr. Fox's garage. Now so much has changed. That was in the 1940s. Mr. John Lewis Freeman was a fine man. He died at 92 years old in 1960. He had a big family. All have gone but 2 children, Winnie McNeil in her 90s and at home in Candor, and another daughter, Catherine, Mrs. Leonard Saunders, in her 70s, lives in Troy. I can think of so many good memories. I have a big family to enjoy and to love and be thankful for. Oh yes, the young man that came to see me about, so many years ago went his way. I finished school, worked, and married in 1943. I've been a widow for 14 years, and to my surprise, this man whom my father wouldn't let me see so many years ago came to see me. He had had a long, full life and had married and had 5 sons. 2 have passed away. His wife had passed away too. He said he came by to see me because he wanted to bring clothes to the clothes closet. I helped do with the clothes closet at Church Macedonia Presbyterian. I told him to see what some of family folks could use first. Well, since that day, he has been to see me every day since about a year ago. We are good friends, only he is 77 years old. I remember my sisters Jessie and Stella and me would have a playhouse in front of the house in the edge of the woods. We made mud pies from red mud. We had wildflowers in our playhouse, and we would sweep it clean and pretend there were different rooms. I remember a big red apple tree beside the house. I remember Grandma going to the barn with the milk bucket to milk around 5 o'clock in the evening. She would bring the buckets of milk in the kitchen, strain it and put it in a crock, and when the milk clabbered, she would put it in a churn, and she would get the dasher and churn the clabber milk into buttermilk, and she would put the butter in the butter dish to eat with hot biscuits and baked sweet potatoes. Grandpa liked boiled eggs and butter. They would divide milk and butter with any neighbors that did not have any. Everyone liked cornbread and buttermilk or sweet milk. I remember the shoe stand and the iron shoes that they put the shoes on to mend. Daddy would use little tacks to nail on the bottoms of our shoes. They were different shoes, I guess, for different size shoes to be used, grown-up and children's shoes. I remember the soot rake to rake out the soot from the cook stove, and the soot rake was used to get the eggs out of the guinea nest. If you put your hand in a guinea's nest, they wouldn't lay in that nest again. They would find another nest in corn cribs or wheat straw stacks. Near the barn were scuppernong grapevines we could walk under to eat the grapes. There was a big wooden board fence around the barn for the mules to walk around in when they were not plowing or hitched to the wagon, hauling up the corn for corn shucking, or wood for the fireplaces and cook stoves, or hauling the corn and wheat to the mill to be ground for cornbread and wheat for bread or hoe cakes or biscuits, and corn cracked for chickens and corn for pigs. I think they fed the mules whole ears of corn and fodder and tops, and maybe bran from the grain. I remember Grandpa had a fodder cutter. Fodder and tops are green corn harvested and let cured, dried, and hauled from the field and put in the barn, and some put in the loft anyway. The barns were filled with feed. I remember Chesley and Ernest Clyde Blake cutting cross ties for Grandpa Cagle. I remember sawmills at Grandpa's at different times, and sometimes I went with Grandma to the salad patch. I would find rabbit eggs. My grandma would put boiled eggs in the patch of greens, and I would find rabbit eggs. I don't remember what I did with them, but they were small brown eggs. My mama would color Easter eggs with red bud bark, and I think red ash bark, too. Oh yeah, corn shuckings in the evening, and the chicken dumplings and sweet potato pies were in the kitchen during the corn shucking, and the wheat threshers when neighbors would help neighbors, and they all enjoyed these get-togethers and food. Well, as time passes, it seems like a long time, and sometimes it seems like yesterday. When we were in high school, grades 8 through 11, we had lots of country friends. I remember one boy riding a mule over to see my sister Stella. We 3 girls finished school, got jobs, worked, and married. Stella is a widow and has a daughter. The daughter married her school sweetheart, and he is a heart doctor, and they have adopted 4 children and have 1 son not adopted. My sister married Peanut Lemons and had 2 sons, Harvey and Larry. As for me, I met Clyde Freeman and later married. I remember the sad day he went to the Army, September 21st, 1941. I went with him and his brother Ben Freeman to meet the bus in Troy and to meet the bus to go to the Army. I think it may have been 2 years. He came home on furlough and we were married, and he was in Westoverfield, Massachusetts. Then he was in Burma, India, and China. When we were young, we sat in the room in front of the fireplace with the family, and you did not go anywhere without Sister or Daddy going with you. You were a bad girl if you went along with a boy. I remember when Clyde asked me to marry him. My dad and 2 sisters were at the fair in Ashboro with us in 1943. My mind goes back to the cane field where Daddy and Grandpa pulled the leaves from the cane stalks and tied them in hands or small bundles for feeding for the cow. They cut the cane stalks off at the ground and took them by mule and wagon to the yard. Then they cut the cane tops seed off for the chickens to eat and the cows too. Then a neighbor, Colin Parson, would come over with his mule Hannah and his cane mill and grind the stalks up in the cane mill, the mule pulling the handle or tongue around and around, grinding the cane stalks to get the juice out. They had a big pan or a vat and cooked the cane juice into syrup with fire under the vat of juice that was set up on big rocks, so the fire underneath set up on big rocks with the fire underneath the pat of. Let me start over. That sentence reads, this is just the way it reads. They had a big pan or vat and cooked the cane juice into syrup with fire under the vat of juice that was set up on big rocks, so the fire underneath the pan vat of juice. This was the same neighbor that shod mules and cooked the syrup. Colin and his 2 sisters were real old. They would come over to our house sometimes to hear the battery radio. They liked Sari and Sally on WSM's Grand Ole Opry on Saturday night. I remember Daddy and 2 of my cousins, Kenny and David Kennedy, and Dewey Bosley from Bisco would go rabbit hunting in daytime, and sometimes they would go possum hunting a little while at night. When my grandparents died, they were dressed and kept at home until funeral time. Mr. Laster, the undertaker, would come from Candor. Neighbors would come and sit up at night. They were buried in the family cemetery on the farm. Back then, lots of families had family cemeteries. If I just sit down and think back of so much, I remember a big hickory nut tree at the woodpile, the pine splinters cut to start the fires in the cook stove and to start the fire in the fireplaces in the mornings, and long rows of stacks of stove wood cut and split and nicely stacked to dry. The wood put on the porches for the fireplace, the straight chairs around the fireplace, and maybe a lamp lit for more light, and a tin tub of warm water for us to take a bath to go to school in the morning. Oh yes, there was a neighbor about a mile from us, Dave and Kate Lemons and son Otis Lemons. I remember the white owl, as it was called back then. It was a pot that my grandma would put under the foot of her bed at night. It was a thick white pot with a handle like on one side and made of real thick material, pottery-like. She used it if she needed to go to the bathroom, which she had no bathroom. And that is the end of that story. Talking about a chamber pot. This next one I wanted to read to you. Here, let's see who this is. The title of this next story, well, it's not really a story. This next entry is Bits of Wisdom from the Good Old Days by Vivian Wilson Green. And even though the name is Vivian, I gather that this is actually a man. Mr. Green, who was born some 75 years ago, is a retired industrial relations director and spends his time writing, speaking to groups, and generally doing what I please. His story for this book is compiled from information from his own delightful book, an autobiography, compendium, and other not-so-enlightening writings. He is the youngest of 9 children, of whom only he and a sister survive, and he was raised on a small farm. Concerning his somewhat unusual appellation, he writes, I could tell you some interesting experiences I've had with this girl's name. Looking back, I am overwhelmed by my parents' wisdom, particularly my mother's. Her formal education was limited, but she could read, write, and figure well. Public schools were non-existent in my parents' days. Their childhood educations were limited to the occasions when community-minded men periodically pooled their financial resources to hire a teacher. I have no idea what grade level, based on today's standards, they attained with this unscheduled and unpredictable system, but they got along in life quite well education-wise. I remember clearly many examples of their wisdom. Gambling. My parents taught that any form of gambling was wrong, even matching for a soft drink. As a smart high school student, I once argued that farming was gambling because you took a chance on making a crop when you planted the seed, and that furthermore, gambling isn't mentioned in the Bible, so it must be okay. Mom's answer, which had to be wisdom because I'm convinced she never read it in a book, was, gambling is an act where someone else has to lose for you to win. Who could possibly argue with that definition? As to my Bible example, she shot me out of the water with no trouble at all. Gambling isn't mentioned, she said, but coveting is, and when you are gambling, you are hoping to take what someone has. What can I say? Card playing. My parents deemed card playing wrong. I didn't understand at the time why they were so opposed, but I know now where they were coming from. Even as a form of entertainment, like a game of setback, their concern was where it could lead. It could begin innocently enough, but they knew there was such a thing as compulsive gambling. Only over their dead bodies was this going to happen to any of their children. I remember clearly one rainy day when we were unable to work in the fields. My brother cut a crude deck of cards from cardboard. He colored and numbered each card with red and black crayons and stacked them into a makeshift deck. As I recall, he worked on them most of the day. My mother observed him closely but wordlessly, and when he finished, she picked up the cards, lifted the eye on the cook stove, and dropped them into the fire. My brother was upset, but I'm sure he got the message loudly and clearly. And so far as I know, no one in my family ever had a gambling problem. Honest measure. During the Depression years and for some time after, my mother and dad sold and bartered eggs and butter to the stores in town. I recall the price we received for eggs in trade for things like sugar, coffee, baking soda, flavoring, or kerosene was sometimes 10 cents a dozen. The cash price was 8 cents a dozen. I'm sure this was a lifesaver for our family during this period. I recall my father bringing the eggs back on a few occasions because the stores were overstocked and would not buy them at any price. My mother's butter was highly regarded. Customers often specifically requested Mrs. Green's butter. She took particular pride in preparing her butter, carefully working out all the water with a wooden paddle to ensure a better taste and to retard spoilage. She also used the paddle to make a beautiful flower design on the butter to give it the appearance of being molded. As a child, I watched her for hours preparing and weighing butter on a small kitchen scale. She always gave 1/8 pound extra with a half-pound package and 1/4 pound extra with a 1-pound package. When I was old enough to read the scales, I questioned her logic in this practice. It appeared to me she was just wasting good butter. Her answer was, "The Bible suggests that we should give good measure, heaping up, and besides, the scales may be incorrect. I will never lose anything by giving a little extra." I eventually learned another lesson about honest measure. As a child, I picked wild blackberries and sold them in town for 20 cents per gallon. I picked and delivered the berries in a lard bucket. The bucket, which originally held 8 pounds of lard, contained a gallon of berries when their level reached to about an inch from the top. My mother always insisted that I fill the bucket to the top, even though I knew it held more than a gallon. Her reasoning was that customers might feel that they were not getting a full gallon, even though I knew they were. To add to my dissatisfaction about berry measurement, I remember that as I picked, the berries tended to settle and compress into the bucket. One time, I got a brilliant idea to make the bucket seem fuller and to lessen my labor. I turned the bucket up to my chest and shook the berries to separate them and give them more apparent bulk. This worked pretty well until my mother noticed the stain on the bib of my overalls. From then on, I just picked until the bucket was full, regardless of how long it took. My mother's ideas didn't appeal to me at the time, but looking back, I can appreciate her view. She never quoted scripture to back up her philosophy, but as I grew up and began reading the Bible more regularly and with perhaps more sincerity, I discovered a scripture which I'm sure she was recalling when she insisted on giving good measure. It was Luke 6:38, and it read, "Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together, and running over, shall men give unto you into your bosom. For with the same measure ye meet withal, it shall be measured to you again." Alcoholic beverages. I never heard it called alcoholic beverages in those days. It was just plain old liquor or whiskey. Mother taught us that we should never take even a sip of beer, wine, whiskey, brandy, home brew, or anything alcoholic. Her advice was never take the first drink. Her philosophy was that it isn't the last drink that makes you drunk, but the first. She felt that if you never take a first drink, you won't need to worry about the last, since there won't be one. How about that? The birds and the bees. My parents never mentioned anything about the birds and the bees to me, but being reared on the farm, I wasn't completely ignorant of the subject. The nearest my mother ever came to discussing it was one day while she and I were chopping in our garden. She pointed out that since I was old enough to start thinking about girls, I didn't dare tell her that I had already done more than think about them. It was okay to kiss a little, but I should keep my hands to myself. What wonderful advice that was. Whoever got into any trouble, especially that kind of trouble, without using their hands? Bad influence. "You are known by the company you keep," my mother often quoted. She also reminded us to remember who you were. She would say, "Suppose you are in a group and one of the group breaks the law. You may be considered guilty even though you had nothing to do with the act, so always think twice before going off with the wrong crowd." Ownership. I can recall a few times as a child when I would want to do something with a toy or some other item that I considered mine, and my mother would tell me I couldn't do it. I would remind her that it was mine and I could do anything I wanted to with it. Her answer would be something like this: "Yes, it is yours, but you are mine, so it follows that everything you own is mine, so you must do as I say." End of time. In our childhood years, I suppose we all have concerns. Some we discuss, and others we just keep to ourselves. One of my concerns was the end of time. I had heard preachers discuss that event and had heard songs which referred to it. One day I asked my mother when she thought the end of time would come. Her answer was, "You need not be too concerned about that event. It may be soon, and it may be thousands of years from now. The only thing you need to think about is your own end of life. When you die, that is the end of time as far as you are concerned." How true, how true. Church attendance. Attending church was never an option for us. When Sunday came, we went to church unless we were sick. If you claimed to be too sick to go to a morning worship and Sunday school, you'd better be prepared to stay in on Sunday afternoon as well. If you were too sick to attend church, you were definitely too sick to play or go anywhere, so we seldom missed church. Respect for your elders. We were taught to be respectful to our elders. We addressed anyone older than we as Mr., Mrs., uncle, aunt, or cousin. This rule applied to everyone to whom we referred in any way. Only those near our own ages or younger were called by their first names. I was raised that way too. Promptness. We were reminded often to always be on time at anything we were to do. My mother's philosophy, which became mine, was always leave earlier than necessary when going someplace, as the extra time will allow for any unforeseen situation which might arise. I have practiced that habit all my life, and it has been helpful innumerable times. This practice was of particularly great value to me during my working life. I was early or on time for many business meetings as a result of leaving home or motel early. This promptness also included paying bills. Politeness. We were taught to be polite, to let others go first, to say please when asking for something, and thank you in return for favors, kind deeds, and gifts. I recall visiting with my oldest brother the home of a man who was instrumental in this brother's college attendance. I was perhaps 4 or 5 at the time. We were to have supper there, and before we left home, my mother reminded me to remember my manners. I may have tried to follow her instructions a little too closely when I requested at supper, "Thank you for the pink beans, please." I was asking to be passed the plate of pinto beans. I don't recall any telltale smiles or other evidence that the adults noticed my over-politeness. However, when my brother related the incident, including my exact words, to my mother when we returned home, she said, "That's all right. It's better to be overly polite than not be polite at all." At that age, I'm sure I wasn't aware of my little social boo-boo, but my mother's remarks served to allay any concerns I could possibly have had. Visiting. My mother told me never to ask for anything to eat when visiting. I could accept anything offered, however, provided I extend my thanks. Also, in visiting, a time limit of a half hour or hour was specified, and I was to inform the lady of the house of the length of time I would stay. She was to advise me when my time was up so I could head for home. There were 2 good purposes of this practice. It prevented me from staying too long and wearing out my welcome, and it gave my mother an expected time to look for me back home. Occasionally, the lady of the house would forget to remind me, but those few times never proved to be a problem because my mother trusted me to tell her the truth. If I had not, I suspect I would have been disciplined. I was told never to handle or pick up objects displayed in homes where I visited. I might drop and perhaps destroy the object. Furthermore, if I was observed overly admiring something, and if the object of my admiration later disappeared, a finger could be pointed to me. All of those lessons were valuable, and if adhered to, will save any person many, many regrets. And that is the end of the Olden tales for today. And we have more that we can read later, like Yellow Root Tea and Maypop Toys, and The Unhappy Cow in the Schoolhouse. We'll do those another day. Thank you so much for watching and listening to these stories of olden days from Central North Carolina. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you again soon.